palace records have reportedly surfaced, revealing a restriction that instantly reframes everything. The Queen allegedly limited Camilla's access to certain royal residences. Not a rumor. Not palace tension. A documented boundary, quiet, formal, and impossible to spin once it exists on paper. Because residences aren't just homes in royal life, they're authority, proximity, and who belongs where. And if the Queen limited access, the real question isn't what was restricted, it's why it was necessary. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The records appear through a controlled internal channel, the kind used when the palace wants information to travel in whispers rather than waves. But whispers can be louder than headlines when the right people hear them. In this dramatized scenario, the moment the records surface, the air changes. Conversations shorten. Doors close more gently, but more often. Eyes communicate what mouths refuse to say. Because a record doesn't behave like rumor. A record behaves like evidence. And evidence creates panic in a system built on controlled perception. The restriction is described as precise, specific residences, specific conditions, specific wording. That precision is what makes it feel dangerous. Vague boundaries can be interpreted. Precise boundaries can only be followed or broken. Insiders describe staff reading the language twice, not because they don't understand it, but because they do. The phrasing doesn't just restrict access, it defines it. It draws lines between public spaces and private sanctums, between ceremonial presence and inner authority. And the more specific the list becomes, the harder it is to pretend it was just about logistics. Senior staff react as if a sealed rule has been unburied, not with shouting, with silent containment. In this dramatized account, you can feel the machine shifting into protection mode. Fewer people in the loop, fewer opportunities for misunderstanding, fewer chances for the wrong name to repeat the wrong detail in the wrong corridor. Because once staff realize a boundary existed on paper, the next fear arrives immediately: how many people knew, and how many people pretended not to. Charles is portrayed as caught between legacy and loyalty to his present. Because a restriction written by the Queen isn't a casual preference, it's a deliberate act of governance. But Charles's reign is built on unity optics, and unity optics demand proximity. If the Queen limited access, honoring that limit could look like distance. If he softens the limit, he risks appearing to override legacy. He's trapped between two kinds of damage: the damage of division and the damage of disrespecting the Crown's final boundaries. William's camp is framed as watching, closely concerned about legitimacy optics. In this dramatized scenario, they don't see residences as buildings, they see them as signals. Who is allowed into which spaces becomes a message the public reads without realizing it is reading. Proximity equals trust, access equals centrality. And if a past monarch limited access, then that limit becomes part of the institution's moral architecture. William's camp fears that ignoring it doesn't just rewrite protocol, it rewrites credibility. Because if the Queen drew a line and the line disappears, people eventually ask why the line existed at all. Camilla's camp reads it as humiliation disguised as protocol. They argue that restricting access turns a person into an outsider by design, that it creates an unspoken hierarchy that the public will sense even if it is never explained. In this dramatized story, the emotional intensity isn't simply about pride, it's about belonging. Residences are where the monarchy feels private, where family becomes institution, where authority breathes behind walls. Being restricted from certain spaces is like being told there are rooms you will never truly enter, no matter the title, no matter the role, no matter how long you stand beside the king. And that's why the palace reacts like it's a threat. Because if the records are real, they don't just describe a boundary, they describe a reason for a boundary. They suggest someone believed access needed controlling, And in royal life, controlling access is never about comfort alone. It's about safeguarding what happens when the doors close, who hears what, who influences what, who is present when decisions form before they are ever announced. Then the cliffhanger hits in the most chilling way possible, not through a reporter, but through staff language. A whisper circulates, simple and absolute. It wasn't optional. It was written. Those words strip away every comforting interpretation. They turn the restriction from possible preference into deliberate instruction. And once something is written, the palace can only do two things: honor it or quietly try to erase it. Both choices leave fingerprints. Because written boundaries don't disappear without consequences, they either harden into legacy or become evidence of something the institution tried to rewrite. And if this restriction was written, then the real story isn't just about where Camilla could go. It's about why the Queen felt she had to define where she could not. But to understand why access to a residence would be restricted at all, you have to understand what royal residences really represent and what had been building behind the scenes long before those records surfaced. To the public, a palace is architecture. Inside the monarchy, it's hierarchy. In this dramatized scenario, insiders explain that access to certain residences isn't about convenience, it's about closeness to the crown's inner sanctum. Who is allowed into which spaces determines who is seen as trusted, central, and legitimate. That's why a restriction doesn't feel like a rule. It feels like a message. And once that message exists, every doorway becomes a line. Residences are framed as symbolic zones: public duty versus private authority. One building may host smiles, ceremonies, and carefully staged unity. Another may hold the quiet rooms where decisions form before they ever become announcements. Insiders describe the monarchy as a map made of doors. Some doors exist for the public story, and some doors exist for the real story. In this dramatized account, the Queen's restriction is not treated like a household detail. It is treated like a boundary between those two worlds. Because access controls optics in ways most people never consider. It controls photos without anyone calling it censorship. It controls meetings without anyone calling it exclusion. It controls presence in key moments, the kind of moments that become proof of belonging. If you are allowed into a residence at the right time, you are seen as central. If you are not allowed, you are seen as separate, no matter what titles say. Insiders suggest that is why residence access is one of the palace's most powerful tools. It shapes the visual narrative while pretending to be logistics. The Queen's boundaries are portrayed as intentional legacy management in this dramatized scenario, not because she wanted cruelty, because she understood symbolism. She understood that once something becomes normal in royal life, it becomes unquestionable. If access is granted freely, it becomes assumed. If it becomes assumed, it becomes impossible to retract without drama. So boundaries, insiders claim, were her way of preventing drift, the slow creeping shift of who belongs where, who is treated as central, and who begins to occupy spaces that quietly redefine hierarchy. Staff culture treats residence access as sacred protocol, not preference. That is one of the most chilling details in this story. Because the staff don't behave like they're following convenience. They behave like they're protecting a code. They memorize patterns. They watch who enters. They track who has permission, even when permission is never spoken out loud. In this dramatized account, the staff reaction to the restriction isn't gossip, it's reverence mixed with fear. Fear that the code has been exposed. Fear that someone will test it. Fear that once people start testing doors, they start testing authority. Charles is shown trying to keep unity while avoiding visible fracture, and that becomes its own tension point. Because unity requires shared spaces. Shared spaces create shared optics. Shared optics create the illusion of harmony, even when harmony is fragile. But boundaries pull against that illusion. Boundaries create distance, and distance invites interpretation. In this dramatized scenario, Charles feels trapped between two kinds of damage: honoring the Queen's boundaries and risking public narratives of separation, or softening the boundaries and risking the accusation that legacy is negotiable. Camilla's presence becomes a focal point for internal loyalty tests. Insiders describe how questions are never asked directly. They are asked through invitations, through room assignments, through where someone is placed during private moments that conveniently become visible. People watch how Charles responds, how William responds, how staff respond. Because in royal life, the quickest way to learn someone's power is to see which doors open for them automatically. And the quickest way to learn someone's vulnerability is to see which doors remain closed, no matter how polite the conversation sounds. That's why the restriction, in this dramatized telling, is more than a rule. It's a statement about legitimacy. It implies that closeness to the Crown's private sanctum must be earned, controlled, and limited. It suggests the Queen believed certain spaces should remain untouched by modern optics or internal pressure. And once you accept that, every doorway becomes a question: who is trusted enough to cross it, and why? Then comes the cliffhanger line that changes the emotional temperature: she was specific about which doors. That remark matters because it removes ambiguity. Specific means deliberate. Specific means planned. Specific means someone took time to define where the line would be drawn. And if the Queen was specific, then the restriction wasn't a random choice, it was protection aimed at something she did not want reshaped. And once that specificity is mentioned, the story stops being about property and becomes about what the Queen was protecting by drawing those boundaries. In this dramatized account, the restriction wasn't vague. It was precise, written in the kind of language that leaves no room for interpretation. A safeguard designed to prevent confusion, protect tradition, and keep certain private spaces untouched by political optics. But once the wording becomes known, something unsettling happens. People don't argue about what it says. They argue about what it implies. Because a restriction like this doesn't exist unless the Queen believed something had to be contained. Insiders frame it as legacy protection, not personal punishment. That distinction matters, because protection implies purpose. It suggests the Queen wasn't acting out of emotion, she was acting out of institutional instinct. The instinct to preserve sacred spaces from becoming stages. Staff are described as visibly uncomfortable when the document is discussed, not because they are shocked by boundaries, but because they recognize the weight of this boundary. They've seen how the palace treats written instructions as law until someone powerful decides they can be treated as guidance. And the moment this restriction appears on paper, everyone starts calculating who will dare to treat it like guidance. A senior figure, in this dramatized telling, reframes it as contextual, and with one word the door to maneuvering opens. Contextual means flexible. Flexible means negotiable. Negotiable means controllable. The language stays polite, but the effect is sharp. What was a line becomes a discussion, and once it becomes a discussion, people begin lobbying not openly, not aggressively, but with the soft tactics royal life excels at. A suggestion here. A concern there. A warning disguised as empathy. The point isn't to challenge the Queen directly. The point is to create enough fog that the boundary can be crossed without anyone admitting it was crossed. Charles is torn in this dramatized scenario, because honoring legacy can create present-day humiliation optics, and the palace fears humiliation optics almost as much as it fears instability. He's portrayed as carrying two loyalties that don't align neatly: loyalty to the Queen's instruction and loyalty to the unity he wants his reign to project. Every path looks like loss. Enforce the restriction, and the public may sense distance. Soften it, and the inner circle learns a dangerous lesson: written legacy can be adjusted when it becomes inconvenient. William's camp interprets the restriction as credibility-first governance. In this dramatized story, they see it as a line drawn for a reason, and they fear what happens if the line disappears. Because if the Queen's boundaries can be softened, then the monarchy's most sacred promise, continuity, order, hierarchy, starts looking like performance. Camilla's camp interprets it as exclusion that cannot be normalized, because normalization is how legitimacy is built. Exclusion, even quiet exclusion, feels like a signal that someone does not belong fully, no matter the titles or the public positioning. Then the cliffhanger deepens the tension. Insiders hint at a follow-up note, something that adds nuance, or urgency, or a clearer intention. A note that would shift the entire debate from interpretation to instruction. Because in royal life, follow-up notes are where the real meaning lives. They're where the sovereign clarifies what must not be misunderstood. And if such a note exists, it threatens the people trying to turn a boundary into a negotiation. And once that follow-up note is mentioned, the story stops being about what was restricted and becomes about who had the power to soften it. In this dramatized story, the breach didn't arrive as a public fight. It arrived as a quiet exception made for practical reasons. A visit. A meeting. A brief access point opened just once, and staff felt it instantly. The restriction wasn't being honored, it was being tested, because in royal life, the first breach matters more than the 10th. Once a boundary is crossed without consequences, it stops being a rule and becomes a negotiation. The first breach is framed as temporary, the kind of one-time adjustment the palace uses when it wants to change reality without declaring it. Staff are instructed to treat questions as routine, fueling suspicion, because routine is what you call something when you don't want people to notice it has meaning. Competing explanations are floated quickly: logistics, security, special circumstance, each one designed to make the exception sound boring. But staff aren't fooled by boredom. Staff are trained to read symbolism. And symbolism is exactly what this breach carries. If the Queen drew a line, someone just stepped over it. Charles is pressured to stay the course for unity optics, because reversing the breach would admit conflict. And admitting conflict is the palace's nightmare. William's camp tightens, anticipating further drift, because drift is how institutions quietly rewrite themselves. A hush culture forms. Don't put it in writing, because writing creates evidence, and evidence creates accountability. The palace can survive rumors. It struggles to survive receipts. Then comes the clearest sign of internal panic. An internal memo is altered, removing one key sentence. A sentence that likely anchored the breach to the Queen's restriction too clearly, or admitted the exception wasn't truly practical, or revealed who authorized it. They remove the sentence to protect the machine, but in doing so, they reveal the machine's fear. Someone is trying to keep the boundary from becoming undeniable. But the real reason that sentence was removed becomes clear when you learn what the restriction threatened to expose and who it would have cornered. The most brutal implication of these records is this: the restriction didn't exist for comfort, it existed for control. In this dramatized scenario, insiders claim the palace feared that without firm boundaries, key spaces would become stages for legitimacy optics. Advisors argue strict limits would create headlines and invite questions. Others argue ignoring limits creates bigger risk long-term, because it teaches the monarchy that legacy is optional. And optional legacy is how institutions rot. Inside this dramatized palace, the argument splits quickly into two camps that sound rational on the surface and ruthless underneath. The optics first camp insists restrictions signal punishment and instability. They warn that if the public senses any blocked doors, the story becomes cruel, divisive, and explosive. They argue unity must be shown, not debated, because unity is what protects the institution from becoming a soap opera. But the legacy first camp argues the opposite with equal intensity. Restrictions prevent manipulation of symbolism. They insist that certain spaces exist precisely because they are not meant to be staged. If you let optics drive access, you turn private authority into a public performance, and once authority becomes performance, legitimacy becomes negotiable. Camilla's camp pushes for unity presence to avoid peripheral optics, because peripheral optics are poison in royal life. If you look sidelined, people assume you are sidelined. If people assume you are sidelined, the next question becomes why. And why leads back to the records. So her camp fights for proximity, not simply to win a door, but to win the message that the door sends. But William's camp, in this dramatized account, fears staged unity becomes manufactured legitimacy. They fear proximity isn't being sought for harmony, it's being sought to rewrite the narrative into something smoother than the truth. And when the future of the monarchy is at stake, smooth narratives can be dangerous. They can hide rot until it becomes collapse. That's where the pressure tactics appear. Soften, shame, isolate, then proceed. Soften with this is for stability. Shame with do you want to damage the institution? Isolate by making resistance look like personal vendetta. Then proceed as if consent was always there. In this dramatized story, nobody says we're overriding the Queen. They say we're interpreting her intent in a modern context. They don't call it defiance. They call it responsibility. And that is how control disguises itself, by wearing the face of calm leadership while it bends boundaries in silence. Charles is portrayed as exhausted, trapped between family and governance, and the exhaustion becomes its own vulnerability. He wants unity, because unity makes his reign feel stable. He wants legacy, because legacy gives the monarchy credibility. But unity and legacy collide when a written restriction becomes a public whisper. In this scenario, every choice he makes has a cost. Enforce the boundary, and the present looks divided. Soften the boundary, and the past looks ignored. And in the middle of that collision, the palace begins looking less like a family and more like a machine trying to protect itself from the implications of its own paperwork. Then comes the cliffhanger that makes everything feel sharper. A name is hinted, someone who authorized the override quietly. Not a loud decision, not a public decree, a quiet authorization that allowed a breach to become precedent, and a precedent to become normal. That hint changes the story because it suggests this wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Someone decided the Queen's boundary could be treated as negotiable, and once someone makes that decision, the question stops being, what does the record say? And becomes who gave themselves the right to rewrite it. And when the question becomes who authorized the override, the story turns from uncomfortable optics into a direct power struggle inside the monarchy. In this dramatized account, William doesn't explode, he calculates. Because as heir, he understands a terrifying truth. If the Queen's boundaries can be softened quietly, then any boundary can be softened when it becomes inconvenient. That doesn't just shake trust. It reshapes how he sees the institution he will one day lead. And when legitimacy starts bleeding in silence, silence becomes complicity unless someone draws a line. William's conflict becomes brutal. Protect unity versus protect credibility. Protect the family's surface calm, or protect the rules that make the institution believable. Catherine is steady support, wary of narrative warfare, because she knows how quickly the palace turns a principled stance into a personality flaw. Advisors urge restraint, don't create a visible fracture as if the fracture isn't already there, just hidden behind polite language. But then a warning reaches William that changes his posture from watchful to decisive. They're writing the story without you. Not in newspapers. Inside the building. Through access, optics, and quiet decisions that become irreversible once repeated. So William begins procedural boundary-setting moves. Not speeches, not public fights, procedure. The language the palace respects. He tightens circles, clarifies permissions, demands confirmations in writing when people prefer whispers. The household senses a future reign forming in real time, because the heir's behavior changes. He stops treating this like a family tension and starts treating it like governance. Because if legacy can be softened today, authority can be softened tomorrow, and William knows that a monarchy that negotiates its own rules in silence eventually loses the right to ask the public for trust. Then the escalation becomes inevitable. A decisive meeting is scheduled to settle residents' access. The very existence of that meeting is an accusation, because it implies the Queen already settled it and someone chose to reopen it. In this dramatized story, that meeting isn't about doors. It's about power. It's about who gets to decide what legacy means when legacy becomes inconvenient. And once a meeting is scheduled to settle something the Queen already settled, the room stops being about access and becomes about who truly holds authority. The most dangerous rooms in royal life are the quiet ones. In this story, the meeting isn't loud, it's loaded. Two futures sit on the table, enforce the Queen's boundaries to protect legacy, or soften them to protect unity optics. Charles arrives carrying crown and grief. William arrives calm but immovable. Camilla's camp arrives determined not to be diminished. And when the final arguments land, the room goes still not because anyone shouted, but because a line is drawn. Two factions emerge instantly, optics first versus legacy first, and they speak like they're protecting the same thing while pulling in opposite directions. The optics first side insists that unity must look effortless, that the public must never see an internal rule turn into a public wound. They argue that boundaries, if enforced too visibly, will be interpreted as punishment. And punishment, they warn, becomes a headline. The legacy first side counters with a colder truth. The Queen drew boundaries because she understood what happens when symbolism is left to drift. They argue that softening the restriction doesn't protect unity, it manufactures it. And manufactured unity is exactly what eventually destroys trust. Charles tries to mediate without appearing weak. But in this dramatized scenario, his mediation becomes the most revealing part of the meeting. Because mediation implies conflict. It implies the crown is being negotiated. He speaks like a man trying to hold two eras in his hands, at once his mother's legacy and his present reality, and the weight shows. There is grief in him, but there is also governance. He wants the decision to feel humane, but he also wants it to feel stable. And those two desires do not always align when the palace is staring at written boundaries like they are explosive material. Then comes the moral argument that hits hard enough to change the atmosphere. This will be seen as betrayal. The words land not as accusation, but as warning. Betrayal of whom? Betrayal of the Queen's intention. Betrayal of the Crown's consistency. Betrayal of the public's belief that rules mean something. In this dramatized story, that sentence forces everyone to confront what they've been avoiding. This isn't about access to a residence. It's about whether the monarchy honors written legacy or treats it as flexible when it becomes inconvenient. William frames boundaries as credibility, not personal conflict. Calm, direct, unshakable. He refuses to let the issue be reduced to feelings or family friction, because that reduction is how the palace neutralizes serious disputes. He argues that once people sense the institution can quietly soften the Queen's written line, they will assume every other line is also negotiable. And when lines become negotiable, legitimacy becomes performance. That is the future he refuses to inherit. Catherine's presence shifts the emotional balance quietly. She doesn't need to dominate the room. Her steadiness does it for her. In this dramatized account, she's the reminder that the future of the monarchy is sitting right there, watching how the present handles legacy. Her calm reads like a warning. If the palace rewrites boundaries now, it teaches the next generation that rules are optional. And optional rules are how institutions lose their moral foundation. Uneasy compliance replaces true agreement. People accept a solution not because they believe it, but because refusing it would create a rupture too visible to contain. And then the cliffhanger lands with surgical precision. A final condition is added that changes everything going forward. It doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds procedural. But procedure is how the palace enforces power without announcing it. The condition locks in who controls access decisions, how exceptions can be granted, and what must be documented before any boundary is softened again. It quietly transforms a family dispute into a governance structure. And when that condition becomes known, it's clear this wasn't just an access dispute, it was a rewrite of how royal power is exercised. This is where people expect the scandal to fade into time. But in this story, it doesn't. It hardens. The palace looks polished again, the schedules look calm again, the faces look composed again, but the fracture becomes visible in the smallest ways. Who arrives where? Who is framed as central? Who is carefully kept apart? The restriction doesn't vanish. It becomes quiet evidence that someone tried to rewrite legacy and someone else refused. A quiet order forms immediately tighter messaging, fewer leaks, narrower circles, because after a battle like that, the palace doesn't relax. It consolidates. Public calm masks private resentment and strategic tension, because everyone inside knows the meeting didn't create peace. It created rules. And rules create winners and losers even when nobody says the words out loud. William's posture signals a new rule in the broader sense too. Boundaries are enforceable. Legacy is not a suggestion. If something is written, it matters. And that philosophy, in this dramatized account, becomes the real headline inside the building. The emotional cost lingers, grief mixed with anger and distrust, because grief is supposed to unify. And yet grief has become the stage where power was negotiated. The palace watches and waits. Because institutions don't forget challenges. They remember who held the line. They remember who tried to soften it. They remember who flinched. And that memory becomes leverage later. Then comes the final twist tease. The records hint at a deeper internal shift in decision-making. Not just about Camilla. Not just about one residence, about how authority is being redistributed quietly, who signs off, who controls access, who decides what unity means. And the cliffhanger is the whisper that refuses to let the story settle. Another residence boundary is next. Another door. Another line. Another test of whether legacy can be rewritten again. Or whether this was the moment the palace learned it can't. And just when it feels like the palace has contained the damage, one last detail emerges, proof that this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.